When we face situations that are uncertain, maybe scary or chaotic, I think sometimes it's easier for us to form opinions about the situation than it is to ask questions. We come in with our preconceived notions, we make judgments or assumptions about the people involved, and that's magnified when we disagree with what people might be doing or saying in that particular situation. Today, I invite you to think about a time in your life when you allowed yourself instead to ask questions in the midst of uncertainty. Here's a simple example to get you started. I moved several times when I was a kid, and one of those new schools that I started was in 6th grade. Not only was it middle school, it was also a move from a bigger city to a small town. The majority of these kids had known each other since kindergarten, or maybe even earlier, and it was completely foreign to me to try and understand relationships that had been built over this length of time, even in 6th grade. Naturally, I had a lot of questions. If you've ever lived in a small town, you quickly know that this is one of the questions you have to ask. Who is related to whom? Everyone seems to be someone's cousin. I wondered who played volleyball, who played basketball, who went to my church, who lived on my street. And people, they had questions about me and for me too. Why did you move so much? Why don't you know how to pronounce the names or streets in this town? And eventually, the question asking on both sides, I think, it helped me to find my people. When have you found yourself asking questions in the midst of an uncertain situation? Those questions are sometimes hard to ask, aren't they? They're by no means guaranteed easy answers, if any answers at all. But I want to suggest that simply asking them can help shed light on the situation. Good questions, they can be helpful. They can even change our perspectives or sometimes the perspectives of the people in our lives. In the Bible, there is a place in each of the Gospels where we read about the feeding of the 5,000. In Matthew and Mark, however, there's also a version of the story that's told a second time, referred to as the feeding of the 4,000. The crowds have again gathered to hear Jesus, and Jesus gets his disciples together to say, hey, we need to feed these people. They haven't eaten in several days. And in Mark chapter 8, the author describes the disciples' passive-aggressive way of disagreeing with Jesus. But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them, they ask. And Jesus, like he often does, asks a question in response to their question. He says, how many loaves do you have? The next thing we know, they're distributing the bread to the crowds. The same happens with some fish. And we read in verse 8 that the people ate and were satisfied. There was even food left over. In the midst of what the disciples originally perceived as a scary scarcity moment, Jesus gives them the assurance of abundance. And Jesus does this by asking a simple question, how many loaves do you have? It's a question of the situation, of the bigger picture, of the disciples' role within that bigger picture. So I wonder, in moments of uncertainty that we face, in the context of disagreements, what would it look like to start with a good question? Because good questions can be helpful.